So when you think of Austria, you probably picture, Mozart, stunning mountains.
Right, the classic image, the Alps, the music.
Exactly. But uh, it turns out there might be something else going on, something deeper beneath that picturesque surface. Scientists are looking into this genetic mystery.
A really peculiar gene variant. People are kind of informally calling it the Austria gene, or sometimes the Alpine code of survival.
And it seems to show up mostly in the mountain populations there.
That's right, predominantly. It's this fascinating mix, really, of hard science, history, and, well, theories that definitely spark curiosity, but also quite a bit of debate.
Okay, so that's what we're diving into today then, to sort of unpack what this gene actually
Yeah,
is.
why it's getting all this academic buzz and the controversy, too,
Mm,
and maybe what it tells us about human resilience.
got it. And just so everyone listening knows, we'll be looking at different findings, various theories, historical angles.
And we'll be careful to say, researchers suggest this, or studies indicate that, or historians point this out.
Right, not presenting anything as absolute fact. Okay, let's get into it. Where does the science actually start with this?
Well, the core of it, scientifically speaking, is what geneticists are calling the Alpine anomaly.
Oh.
They found these unusually high frequencies of a specific mitochondrial haplogroup.
Okay.
It's called Haplogroup K1, and it's especially noticeable in places like Tyrol and Vorarlberg, right in the Austrian Alps.
Haplogroup K1, and you said mitochondrial, so that means it's passed down through the maternal line, right?
Exactly right. Mitochondrial DNA comes only from the mother. So this K1 haplogroup it's a really powerful tool for tracing those ancient maternal lines, population movements. It gives quite a clear signal.
And it's not just that it exists there more often, there are actual traits linked to it.
Yeah, that's what the studies are consistently showing. Researchers link this specific haplogroup to some, well, pretty remarkable biological characteristics.
Like what?
Things like enhanced cellular repair mechanisms,
Okay.
a lower risk for certain neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's,
Mm.
and even potentially superior oxygen processing, especially relevant at high altitudes, of course.
Superior oxygen processing. That sounds like a huge advantage in the mountains.
It certainly would be.
Uh,
Which is why you sometimes hear researchers sort of informally talk about the Alpine resilience gene.
okay, that makes sense. And does this idea then connect to, the reputation Austrian mountaineers have always had for incredible endurance?
It absolutely feeds into that. This is where you get the whole oxygen advantage debate. I mean, people have admired Austrian climbers and skiers for ages,
Right.
and numerous studies do suggest that these specific alpine communities seem to have adapted really well to hypoxic conditions, low oxygen,
Mm.
better than many other groups.
Yeah, couldn't some of that just be, living at altitude for generations, training,
Right.
lifestyle factors? How much is potentially genetic versus just acclimatization?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Hmm.
And it's almost certainly a mix. Lifestyle, training, acclimatization, they all play huge roles.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this compelling theory some researchers are exploring. It suggests that way back, maybe during the last ice age, the survivors in these isolated alpine areas might have developed specific genetic mutations
For what purpose?
for enhancing red blood cell efficiency, making oxygen transport just work better, essentially.
Huh. Are there parallels elsewhere?
Researchers often point to groups like the Sherpas in Nepal or certain Andean tribes in South America. They also show remarkable adaptations to high altitude, and genetics seems to be a big part of their story too.
So the idea is that something similar might have happened in the Alps.
Potentially, yes. That's the theory being investigated.
And it makes you wonder then, doesn't it, about elite athletes? Austrian skiers, mountaineers, biathlon racers. Could they be getting a bit of an unknown boost from this genetic legacy?
It's definitely speculative, but it's a fascinating thought. That hidden advantage playing out in endurance sports.
It really is. And thinking about legacy, that brings us to the history, doesn't it? How does Austria's past fit into this genetic picture?
Well, that's where it gets kind of interesting because historically, Austria is often seen as this crossroads of Europe, right? A big cultural melting pot.
Yeah, that's the standard view. Lots of movement, lots of mixing.
And in many ways, that's true. But the genetic studies, especially focus on these alpine regions, they suggest something a bit different. It seems the mountains themselves, the difficult terrain,
Yeah.
they acted as barriers, creating these pockets of relative genetic isolation for centuries. Little reservoir.
So a kind of genetic bottleneck, is that the term? Like trapping certain gene versions in those valleys?
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. A bottleneck implies the population shrank or was isolated, losing some overall diversity, but potentially increasing the frequency of the whatever genes were already there.
Okay.
So in these isolated valleys, specific mutations, maybe including this haplogroup K1 frequency, could have been preserved, maybe even amplified.
While they got diluted or disappeared elsewhere because there was more mixing going on.
Exactly. Now, we need to be careful here. The idea of a pure gene pool is, frankly, a misnomer in genetics. All humans share deep ancestry.
Right.
But the relative isolation meant certain genetic patterns just became much more common, much more pronounced in those specific alpine areas compared to the surrounding regions.
And this is obviously where things can get sensitive. Discussing distinct regional genetics, especially given Europe's history, and particularly the region's history with eugenics under the Nazis, it requires extreme care.
Absolutely critical. Researchers are very conscious of this. There's a real effort to avoid language that overemphasizes special or unique regional genetics in a way that could be misused by, fringe groups or feed into dangerous ideologies.
So it's about sticking to the science, presenting findings responsibly, without the hype or the potential for misinterpretation.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance.
Which brings us nicely to the medical side. If these traits exist, what are the potential health implications people are actually researching?
Right. So medical researchers are looking quite seriously into potential links between this, let's call it the Austrian Gene cluster, and some interesting health outcomes.
Such as?
Well, we mentioned the lower risk of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. That's one major area.
Okay.
They're also investigating possible connections to longer telomeres.
Telomeres. Those are the caps on the ends of chromosomes related to aging.
That's them. Longer telomeres are generally associated with slower cellular aging, potentially better health span. And then there's also this rare resistance to altitude sickness that seems to pop up.
Okay, that all sounds incredibly positive, almost too good to be true, like a super gene narrative. Is there skepticism?
Oh, absolutely. Healthy skepticism is crucial in science. Critics point out, quite rightly, that many of the initial studies might have relatively small sample sizes.
Right. Hard to draw firm conclusions then.
Exactly. And there's always the concern that findings get, let's say, amplified or exaggerated, especially when the media picks up on a potentially exciting story like a super gene.
Happens all the time.
It does. But on the other hand, there are whispers, some sources suggest, that pharmaceutical companies are actually quietly funding some of this research.
Looking for inspiration for new drugs, maybe, based on these protective traits.
That seems to be the idea. So you have this tension, right? Promising early findings, the need for much more rigorous validation, and the potential commercial interest. A classic scenario in cutting-edge research.
So the big question hangs there. Could Austria hold a key to the next anti-aging or neuroprotective breakthrough? Or is it mostly, scientific sensationalism at this stage?
That's exactly the question researchers are grappling with.
And speaking of, sensationalism, you can't really talk about unique genetics without bumping into some wilder theories, can you? Especially online.
Slight chuckle. You certainly can. And this topic is definitely no exception. We're not talking ancient aliens shaping DNA in the Alps, are we?
Thankfully, no credible science points there. But this is where you get into what some people have almost jokingly called the X-Files of European DNA.
Okay. Intrigued. What does that involve?
Well, there are claims, from a very small number of researchers, mind you, that certain specific genetic markers found in a few very isolated Austrian villages, they don't seem to trace back neatly to any known European lineage based on current databases.
Anomalous markers.
Exactly. And you can probably guess what happened next online, right?
Oh boy, let me guess. Lost tribes, ancient migrations no one knew about.
You got it. Everything from previously unknown ancient migrations, theories about survivors from Atlantis finding refuge in the Alps.
Atlantis. Seriously.
Seriously. And yes, even stretching into extraterrestrial hypotheses. It's a whole ecosystem on blogs, forums, YouTube.
Right. And let's be absolutely clear here. Is there any solid scientific backing for any of that?
Zero. None whatsoever. It's crucial to state that unequivocally. While these online theories might vaguely mention ancestry or markers, they lack the rigorous large-scale genomic sequencing across diverse populations that geneticists actually use to establish lineage.
So they're essentially just stories. Speculation built on maybe misinterpreted or very preliminary findings.
Pretty much. Compelling stories for some, maybe, but completely detached from the actual scientific evidence and methodology. The conclusions jump way beyond what any data could support.
Good to clarify that firmly.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit. The specific haplogroup, the endurance lengths, the historical isolation, the medical potential, even the fringe theories. Where does this leave us with the whole Austria gene idea?
It's still very much an open question, isn't it? Is it really a distinct relic of Ice Age evolution providing tangible advantages?
Or is it more of a statistical concentration, maybe amplified by isolation, whose actual effects are still being debated or perhaps overstated?
Exactly. It's this blend of intriguing scientific possibility and maybe a compelling narrative that adds another layer of mystery to an already fascinating place.
So the big takeaway is the jury's still out, but the research is active.
I think that's fair. Historians definitely see interesting patterns in the population history. Scientists are clearly intrigued by the genetic data and potential health links.
And people will keep debating what it all means.
No doubt about that.
Which leads to our final thought for you, the listener. After hearing all this, what's your perspective? Do you think certain populations can possess genuine genetic advantages that go beyond just adapting to their environment over time?
And specifically thinking about the Austria gene, is it a key to resilience, a quirk of history, or something else entirely?
What's your theory? We'd be curious to know how you piece this puzzle together.